Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Russell Jensen. My Tlingit name is Shekaguk. I am the development officer here at Sealaska Heritage, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our fall lecture series. Sealaska Heritage is committed to providing accessible community programming, but none of it would be possible without donors. You can contribute online at sealaskaheritage.org. Today's lecture is with Dr. William Fitzhugh, presenting on some questions in Arctic anthropology. Dr. Fitzhugh has led archaeological projects in northern Canada, Siberia, and Mongolia, producing landmark exhibitions on northern cultures, including the Ainu of Japan and Viking art. In addition to his work at the Smithsonian, Fitzhugh serves as a senior scientist and visiting professor at Dartmouth College, contributing to global conversations on Arctic research. There is an opportunity for questions at the end of the lecture. If you're here in person, please remember to silence your cell phones. And welcome our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Pleasure to be here. It's been quite a few years since I was in Juneau. I'm Bill Fitzhugh, as David mentioned. I've been a curator at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian since 1970. And what I've been doing is, we've created something called the Arctic Studies Center. Some of you may be familiar with it. We needed to do something to promote education and knowledge about the Arctic. And back in the early days in the 70s and 80s when we were getting this off the ground, the Arctic seemed like a very different place than it is today. With all of the new climate changes and political changes and cultural issues and things like that, it's been quite an amazing 50 years to see things develop. What I'm going to do today, well, let me mention that we as part of the Arctic Studies Center in the 90s, we opened an office, the Smithsonian regional office in Anchorage at the Anchorage Museum, and some of you may have seen that or may have a chance to go there. It's a wonderful display of objects that the Smithsonian has collected from Alaska and nearby areas, as well as the American Indian Museum. So we teamed up together and produced a wonderful exhibit curated by Aaron Kroll, who's a member of the Arctic Studies Center running the Anchorage office. And his assistant, Dawn Biddison, is doing a wonderful job with educational programming and media and arts and crafts and things like that. So we're very excited I'm excited to be back here and to be giving you some kind of a review. It's a little bit of a biographical story because when I started work in the Arctic, there was not very many things going on. There were very few workers. There were people like Fro Rainey and others in Alaska. The Danes were very active in Greenland and a little bit in Alaska. The Smithsonian's Henry Collins had done some wonderful work in St. Lawrence Island and nearby areas of Alaska. So we were building on some collections that had been made in mostly ethnographic materials that came to the Smithsonian in the 1880s and 90s. And I'll be mentioning some of that, as we go through the talk here. So I'll start off talking about the Eastern Arctic, what we have learned, and still some questions that have not been answered. The Smithsonian started in 1843, and our Alaska work began in the 1870s and was very vigorous for the next 20 or 30 years and gradually moved from ethnographic collecting to science and archaeology, some linguistics and so forth. So we'll dig right in. On the left here you see the Arctic Circumpolar region, and the one things that I have done in the time I've been at the Smithsonian is to expand beyond the Eastern Arctic and Alaska to build stories about the entire Circumpolar region. And one of the amazing things about this area is that it's an area in which connections have been happening for 40,000 years as people have moved back and forth around the shores of the Arctic and the nearby forest and tundra regions. Coming into the Americas around 20,000 years ago. But in all of that time, these people have been maintaining contacts with each other. There are a lot of cultural similarities as well as many differences, but this is the one place in the world where cultural connections have been happening for thousands and thousands of years as apart, from the North Atlantic region where those connections were only about 1,000 years old. So the people of the North in the Arctic circumpolar areas are dealing with many of the same animals, the caribou, the seals, the whales, the walrus, and so forth. And so their environment was quite similar. There are many continuities and very few discontinuities in that area. So that's given a special character to the North that you don't have anywhere else in the world, where the big oceans are separating people. And that's been really exciting to explore the connections that we can now start to develop in those regions. And of course, the languages you see on the right shows you the great diversity, but also the very similar languages that have been spread across vast areas, say from Western Alaska to Greenland, or in many areas in Siberia as well. So one of the really earliest stories about the North North American Arctic and about the people, who I'll be using Inuit when I'm talking to about historical peoples of the North, but because of archaeology, we don't know exactly the ethnicity of many of these early people, so it's very handy to use the old term Eskimos when you talk about origins of the culture and things like that. So that's just something to keep in mind as I'm proceeding. But this was the first chance when Martin Frobisher in the 1576 crossed the North Atlantic and came to Baffin Island and met the Inuit there for the first time. It was the first chance for Europeans, post-Viking Europeans, to be able to meet these people from the other parts, across the ocean. And one of the mysteries that was created at that time was a bunch of sailors who, in the last voyage, disappeared when the fleets were were sailing back to Europe, and there was a big storm, and there's been a mystery about what happened to those sailors who were left behind. And Susan Rowley and others discovered that there are still Inuit oral histories about those people who discovered that the rest of their fleet had gone away and who tried to rebuild a boat out of scraps of iron and iron blooms that they found in wood left behind to try to sail back home, but they were caught in the ice, the boat was crushed. And so we have some really interesting stories at the very end of that period. And this is the first time when Europeans got a good chance at what Inuit people and their cultures were like, because they had some wonderful writers with them on these expeditions. They called them gentlemen at the time, who wrote down the descriptions of the Inuit, and there were battles and there was some trading, sort of commonplace stories about what happened, in other times and places too, when Europeans first met the Inuit. So this is one of the unanswered questions that we have about that early time. People always are curious about harpoons and what the technology is that people have been able to use to harvest sea mammals particularly. And over the last 6,000 years, harpoons have been developed, probably first in the Amur region, eastern Siberia, spreading into the North Pacific. And you see here in this slide the function of the two types of harpoons, the barbed harpoon and then the toggling harpoon, which is by far the more secure method to attach yourself to a sea mammal. And over time, they learned how to make these harpoons that would work for seals that were very small harpoons, to walrus, and eventually to whaling harpoons that allowed them to capture large whales starting about 500 AD. So that technology is really important, and one of the interesting things about what we have learned is that the toggling harpoon was developed probably in the North Pacific region, spread into the east, and in the 1500s, when the Basque whalers spread from Spain into into the area around Davis Strait in Newfoundland, they discovered Inuit using much better harpoons than they had, which are these big iron things that you see, which were really like barbed arrows, a very inefficient way to hunt a whale. So it's just one of those really interesting demonstrations that the archaeologists have been able to show that the Inuit and early peoples in North America and the North Pacific, had developed a far superior way to hunt increasingly large sea mammals. And that history is the history of the early Paleo-Eskimos to the modern Inuit, harvesting at first small sea mammals and then learning how to capture walrus and eventually how to capture whales, which gave them the impetus to really expand the energy base of their society. Some of the early origins have always been questions that anthropologists have asked about the origins of Eskimo cultures and so forth. And in the early days, back in the early part of the 20th century, the idea was maybe the Eskimos came from some of the archaic cultures of North America, eastern North America. And you see here a few of the Inuit ulu on the right, and then next to it this one without a handle, which is an archaic ulu from eastern North America dating around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So people started comparing those Eskimo tools to the things that we knew from the archaic, and they developed theories that maybe the Eskimos spread from the New England area up into the Arctic and spread out in the Arctic in that direction. But we quickly discovered that it was quite the opposite. And there were various theories that maybe the Eskimos early people came from the caribou hunters in the barren grounds in central Canada, worked their way out to the coast and adapted to sea mammals and so forth. But it was determined largely by Henry Collins and the Danish archaeologist Terkel Mathiasen that Alaska was really the source of all of these Inuit cultures and their predecessors in the north. And this diagram shows you two major migrations from Alaska area into the eastern Arctic and Greenland. The first, the blue arrow, is the Paleo-Eskimos, people who descended from Siberian hunters around 5,000 years ago and moved into Alaska and then pioneered the sites and expanded their culture into the Canadian Arctic Islands and Greenland. This happened about 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, when the first time that the glacial ice melted out of the northern Canadian islands and opened up channels which allowed seals and walrus and whales and people to populate an area that had been previously covered with ice. And they were there for 3,000 years, and then the Dorset culture developed as a late Paleo-Eskimo culture. And then the second major migration was the Thule, or we call it Neo-Eskimo, migration about 1300 AD. That's the orange arrow that you see here. And that raised a lot of questions for the archaeologists to try to figure out what was the relationship between these two people when the later Thule migration occurred and they ran into these Dorset people, what happened? And this was a major issue. But at least with the archaeology, we know very clearly what those migrations were, what their tool complexes were like, and so forth. So one of the big issues was, why would the Thule culture leave Alaska? Well, they had learned how to hunt big whales, and in the medieval warm period, the ice channels in the Arctic islands opened up, and the whales were able to meet from the North Atlantic in the North Pacific and breed and exchange genetic material through the Arctic areas. And so that's one idea, and it certainly was important feature, which enabled the Alaskan people to move into the Canadian Arctic Islands, to Greenland, and eventually to Labrador. But the other possibility was that they had heard about the Vikings in Greenland through the Dorset networks in the northern Canada, because there were Dorset pre-Thule people there. And around 1,000 to 1,300 years ago, they started using iron tips on their knives and harpoons. So when we were digging those kind of sites, we began to ask, what is this? And it turns out that most of that iron is meteoric iron. And meteoric iron can only come from one place, which is northwest Greenland, what we call the Cape York meteor fall, and that is up right over here, Cape York. So in any case, the late Dorset people started using iron, and we think that the people in Alaska who were having to buy iron from Siberia at very high prices, they may have said, well, here we go. We have open water, we have whales, which we know how to hunt, and we've heard stories about iron in the east. So that may have been another attraction, as well as the warming, of course, which occurred. So then the question, one of the questions, and this is one that remains unanswered, and I'm using these red question marks for the unanswered questions and the little green yes for the ones that we have been able to answer. So what was the Thule contact, the Dorset Thule contact like? And we did some excavations in northern Labrador over here. And we found, in addition, some beautiful art like this very rough mask and so forth. We found that these sites were dating around 1300, 1350 AD. And this is about the time when the Thule people migrated into the eastern Arctic. So it's, we discovered that many of the late harpoon heads in the late Dorset culture, harpoon heads like this over here, these are the same type of arrowhead made of iron recently, like 19th century in Greenland. But that is a type of harpoon head that was common in the late Dorset culture and became a major type in the Thule culture. So we know that there were a lot of cultural exchanges going on, but the question is, you know, were they meeting Dorset people, mixing with them? Were they adopting their tools, which they would find lying on the ground in the sites that they visited that had been occupied by Dorset people and so forth? Or were they something different going on? And the geneticists have suggested that there is really no Dorset DNA in the modern Thule and Inuit populations today, suggesting that there was really no genetic exchange between those peoples at all. And that could mean that the Thule people basically wiped out the Dorset culture, or that the Dorset people, who were very much less an aggressive culture, they didn't have dogs, they didn't have big umiaks and things like this. The stories from some of the Norse sagas would suggest that the Dorset people just, you know, ran off into the hills. And there are other cases where when Martin Frobisher was trying to actually capture some Inuit, they would jump off cliffs and drown themselves rather than be captured. So this may have been the sort of end that we have for the Dorset culture in the face of this big Thule onslaught. So this is a real interesting question that still is not resolved today. Another one that's not resolved is the Sadlermiut people. The Sadlermiut were a Thule culture, but they had a rather interesting technology. They lived in the northern part of Hudson Bay, and they made these tools made out of chert. This is very unlike any Thule culture. Thule people did not chip stone, they ground stone. And so there were a lot of questions. This was from 1824, when this interesting picture of a Sadlermiut paddling a walrus hide out to meet George Lyons. 100 years later, that culture became completely extinct. It was wiped out in an epidemic introduced by the whalers in 1903. And when Henry Collins, my predecessor at the Smithsonian, went to dig some Sadlermiut sites, he found these chipstone arrowheads like this, making it seem to us as though maybe these are Dorset people who had lived on the outskirts of Thule settlements and somehow survived into the 20th century, only to die of disease. Now we've been doing a new research on that, and it looks very much like these are independent inventions by a Thule people who were scared, had no good slate resources, and were chipping artifacts on their own account that looked rather like the Dorset artifacts that people who lived there before them used. So this is the kind of question that still is motivating archaeologists. We really don't have a good answer, and we need to do a lot more work. I spent almost 20 years working on culture history in Labrador. I picked that area to work. I'll show you a slide here. This is Labrador coast has, if you look at the air photo, satellite photo, you see the Labrador Current coming down from the north, and that's a big, wide, almost 50, 100-mile wide or kilometer wide trail of ice in the wintertime, bringing vegetation patterns very south, so tundra all along this strip all the way down like that. So this is a great area for Eskimos to occupy. Well, in the interior, this is occupied by Indian in the forested areas. So it became a very exciting area to do, projects in, and we ended up learning a lot about the Eskimo history over on this side. This is the north part of the coast, and over here is the southern part with all the different Indian cultures going back to 8,000 years. So we've had a lot of success defining the culture history in this area. It's one of the areas where we really have a very close correspondence between the culture history and the climate history of the regions, because when there were cold periods, we had pack ice expanding south into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the Eskimo people, Paleo-Eskimo and recent Eskimo people would come there, follow the pack ice and the Arctic seals and walrus and so forth into those areas. In the warmer periods, they would retreat north, the Indians would advance, and so you have this kind of a effect like this coming north and south with the Indians moving north when they could, Eskimos moving south, and because the Eskimos were largely depending on the marine source, the marine animals, it was possible for them to occupy these coastal regions even if Indians were on the interior. So it was quite an exciting place to do work on the history and connection between cultures and the environments that they lived in. We developed this idea that there were very different adaptations in the boreal forest and the coastal regions with the marine resources available, and it turned out that the culture history on the interior of Labrador, which was the Indian or Innu culture history, for 8,000 years was very broken up into short segments, different cultures, different populations, different raw materials. Whereas on the coast, after 4,000 years ago, when the first Inuit, Paleo-Inuit people came, there was a long continuity of cultures from Dorset culture into Thule culture and so forth. So you have a very different model for cultural survival in coastal regions where you have very mixed resources, and on the interior where you have a very chancy adaptation largely focused on caribou, whose populations crash and then build up and crash. And so on the coast you have this much more steady state, many more resources available. On the interior, these very dynamic population fluctuations. So that's a function of these different type of adaptations that were similar to in many other places in the world as well. So part of my work there was to look into the history of the connection where the southernmost Inuit people had been able to live, and what happened and why were they there and so forth. So this drew me into the eastern Gulf of St. Lawrence, where we discovered sites where the Inuit had lived in the last 300 to 400 years, west of Newfoundland on the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And we found a wonderful site called the Hare Harbor site, where we had both Basques and Inuit living together at one time. And we found out that we had underwater deposits here. We had large Basque underwater deposits of ballast stones, finding lots of ceramics and wonderful things down there. While in the land area up above, we had not only Basque sites, but Inuit sites full of Basque material culture. So this was really exciting to see, the southernmost Eskimos drawn to that area, mixing together, working with the Basques, sharing materials with them, sharing probably their capabilities for hunting whales, and acquiring a lot of European culture in the meantime. And this was very obvious in some of the sites here. We had a Basque cookhouse full of with a lot of Inuit soapstone pots from women who were there running a workshop, cookhouse, and maybe a bathhouse or something for the Basques. Over here we had a Basque smithy, and then here we found underneath the smithy an Inuit winter house, another Inuit winter house here. So really exciting, finds with these cultural, cultural patterns, which are very different from the Labrador coast, where it was largely raiding and trading and antagonism. Frequently, hostilities were common between the early Inuit around the 1600s, whereas in the lower North Shore, there seemed to be a different pattern of accommodation, where the Basque were working with the Inuit, sharing materials and so on. And this story is completely unknown except in archaeology. So that was a great, that was a kind of an answered question that we had that really gave us a lot of insight, and it was all based on this harp seal migration that comes down in December down the coast into the Gulf here, and it served as a pathway for Inuit to occupy these areas, not only in the Dorset culture but in the Thule culture as well. And then in the time that we're seeing firsthand today, where we have a lot of warming and there's almost no ice forming in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the harp seals that give birth in this area can no longer do that, and they give birth out here. And so we have a real mechanism for how these cultures expand and contract particularly the Eskimo cultures, Inuit cultures in this, because of the climate history in the marine system available here. So another thing that we've been able to learn a lot about recently is the exploration stories from the Europeans who began exploring into the Eastern Arctic. And the Franklin expeditions were, probably you've seen some of the news about the finds, the ships they've discovered in Hudson Bay area, where these Franklin ships, two of them, the Erebus and Terror, were caught and frozen in, and virtually their entire crews died out over the course of 4 or 5 years as they tried to first escape the ice, which they couldn't. This was in the middle of the Little Ice Age, if you recall. And then the survivors tried to escape by traveling south. And all the time they were living in the midst of Inuit, villages and people who they met and saw, but who couldn't help them, and who were actually looking at the Franklin voyage people as suppliers of iron and ships' hardwood and boats and other things that they desperately, could use. So this was a pretty interesting stuff. Parks Canada discovered where the boats were. Unfortunately, they could have found out decades earlier if they'd asked some of the Inuit in Hudson Bay who knew exactly where the boats were. And were keeping, they just never were asked specifically about it. This was an expansion of the Franklin attitude that the English people could go into this unfamiliar territory and somehow find a passage to Asia and the West without really knowing anything, without talking to the local people. And here we have Parks Canada replicating that story in the Franklin search things, where they could have found out exactly where these vessels were, but waited quite long before they began to interact and collaborate with the Inuit, who knew exactly where these boats were. But anyway, we'll be hearing a lot more about that history as well. So that's another interesting story that we're knowing quite a lot about as we go along. Just a little side comment here on the Vikings. I did a big exhibit at the Smithsonian called Vikings, the North Atlantic Saga. And that traveled around North America and into Canada. And we had wonderful participation from the Scandinavians, who loaned a lot of artifacts and so on. And the point of that exhibit and research project was to show that the Viking stories, which are common in Europe and have been known for a long time, there was another whole story on the western side, in the Western Atlantic, about what happened when they went from Iceland to Greenland and from Greenland into North America. And we explored a lot of that history in the big exhibit that we did and circulated. We found out that the Vikings did not get to many places where people thought they got. They did not get down to Maine, where there was a Norse penny that was found. They did not get way over here into the Dakotas and Minnesota, where the Kensington runestone, the fake runestone, was found. We still don't know what happened exactly up in this area here. but I was part of a dig right here in the Hudson Bay area where we found a penny that was a Viking, sorry, not a penny, it was an amulet in an Eskimo, in a Dorset house there. So we have been learning more about the contact and trade and connections of the Norse in these areas. These are some of the finds that have been made. That's the pendant that I found that was traced back to Norse copper in a Dorset site in Hudson Bay, dating around 1300. This is the Norse penny, sometimes called the Maine penny, found on the coast of Maine. It dates to 1080 AD, and the Vikings were only known from the sagas to be in the New World around and Lansa Meadows around 1000 AD. So here's 80 years later, there's a penny minted in Scandinavia that was found in an Indian site on the coast of Maine. So apparently the Norse continued having connections with the Eastern Indian people into that for at least 80 years after the time of Leif Erikson and so forth. And this is another interesting piece. This is made of Ramachurt, which is a stone known only in northern Labrador. It was found in a Norse grave in West Greenland in Sandnes, indicating that maybe a body of a Norseman came back to Sandnes to be buried with an Indian arrowhead from Labrador in his body. Now, the find came from a dirt pile when they were excavating, and they weren't sure exactly whether it was in a Norse body or not. So, but connections. And then this wonderful figurine here was excavated in a Thule house around 1350, and it shows, it's a little wooden carving, very typical of a Thule Inuit people, but not wearing a costume like this. It looks like a cross on the breast and a hem and a split cloak. Looks very much like an Inuit carving of a Norseman who they met somehow and knew exactly what kind of clothes they were wearing. So shifting to the West now, my job as a curator at the National Museum of Natural History was to watch over the Arctic collections, and I discovered soon after I got there that we had these wonderful collections from Western Alaska made by a bunch of naturalists in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, one of whom was Edward Nelson, pictured here, who collected almost 10,000 ethnographic artifacts, beautifully documented, and had not been used by the Smithsonian, not been put on exhibit or anything. So I with Susan Kaplan, I put together a show called the Inuit Spirit World of the Bering Sea Eskimo. And that show also traveled here in Alaska and around the country, including some wonderful masks and carvings and so forth, and gave us a really good picture of what the life was like for these Yupik people. And what I discovered and hadn't known before was that the Southwest Alaskan Yupik people were very, very different from the Inuit peoples of the North Coast, the Inupiat people, or St. Lawrence Island people. Very different culture, very different language, different forms, and much more expressive art compared to the slightly simpler kind of art and representations used by most Thule and northern Inuit peoples. So that was an exciting discovery. And this goes back, the origins of that culture goes back to the time when Henry Collins, who was my predecessor at the Smithsonian, went to Alaska and dug sites on St. Lawrence Island, big, deep midden sites where he found history of Inuit cultures going all the way back to around 500, 400 AD. And out of that work, he defined the history, the origin history of the Eskimos, which had never been known in Bering Strait before. It was always seemed like very recent cultures, and where did they come from? Well, Collins' excavations demonstrated the gradual transition, you know, into earlier and earlier Eskimo types of cultures in that area. And here he's seen with Paul Sealaska, who's one of his workers, and his Sealaska granddaughter has become one of the very famous Alaskan artists today. So I was building on Henry Collins' work as I learned about the Inuit cultures of the eastern, of the Bering Strait area. And one of the things that Collins had discovered, along with his Russian counterparts, Sergei Rutinov, is the symbolic history of the Bering Sea Eskimo harpoon. And this is a picture of the beautiful Arctic carvings here. This is Old Bering Sea carving, but also you have Arctic material like this. This is Old Bering Sea. We never knew from the Alaskan material how the system worked. They were always separate artifacts. But in the Russian excavations at Ekven, they discovered how these pieces all fit together, and that these so-called winged objects were counterweights for the heavy walrus ivory foreshaft and the front end of the harpoon, and that they included this spirit controller figure on this thing here. And on the harpoon heads, we saw these bird-like feathers and so forth. So this is like a bird of prey was the harpoon head, and the spirit controller was the god back in the sky who was overwatching all of this stuff. So this whole system became very exciting for us to understand more about the symbolism of these early Eskimo cultures in Alaska. And we were able to trace the history from the earliest, this is Iputak and Old Bering Sea material here. And these are Yupik, Edward Nelson's collections from Southwest Alaska. And you can see the resemblance of these harpoon types to these early Old Bering Sea types here. So we discovered that the Yupik cultures could be tracked right back into the Old Bering Sea cultures and Akvik cultures in Alaska. And that was another exciting discovery. One of the unanswered questions is the question of the Akvik culture. We really don't know. It's one of these figurines, these so-called Akvik Madonnas, are very, very beautiful pieces of work, but they probably were not considered to be like special art pieces by the people in the Old Bering Sea and the Akvik people. And a lot of the designs on them may have been tattoos on the actual individuals, so that these were the cores for dolls, which we found very common, in Edward Nelson's collection. So here's another story where you have this wonderful evolution from an early type up into the modern ethnographic type, and with all the decorations which probably represented tattoos on the original people that these carvings were made about. So that was another exciting thing that we found out. One of the questions from the Southwest Alaska area and the Northwest Coast area is the complexity of cultures. We always thought that these Arctic peoples were living very close to starvation, that they often didn't survive, and that they had to migrate vast distances to new territories when ice changes or climate changes and so forth. Whereas when you get into the southern Bering Sea and the Southwest Alaska and Northwest Coast, you have this very rich ecology. And so we realized that these people who are living in these areas had an entirely different kind of life with many more resources and many more complex social systems, warfare, and clan developments, and so forth. So this is something that had not been pointed out to the early anthropologists who worked in these areas, who were mostly concerned with art and images and so forth. Now we realize that these maritime adapted people of northwestern North America have many of the trappings of very advanced societies whose subsistence was based on agriculture. So marine systems in plentiful areas where they're very common, like in the North Pacific, gave cultures the opportunity to make a lot of cultural developments not seen in many other areas. So we then asked the question of where are these cultures coming from Western Alaska. We knew that they were the source of the Eastern Arctic cultures, both the Dorset and Thule. What about the Eskimo origins deeper down in time, because Collins' material had only been able to scratch the surface the first 2,000 years. And so this led us into discussions with our Russian colleagues, and we were very fortunate. In the 90s, it was possible to work a lot with the Russians, and unfortunately not true today. So we began to look into the connections across the Northwest, into the Southeast, the what is the relationship between the Alaskan Eskimo cultures and the cultures of the Northwest Coast, and then also across the Bering Strait into Asia. And we have some wonderful, examples of things where it's very interesting. Comparisons could be made between the Tlingit robes and the Shang imagery here, between some of your Old Bering Sea carving styles and some of your Scythian emblems and things like that. So this led us into, across the Bering Strait and into Siberia. And these connections could be seen in shamanism, ritual, and mythology, and so forth, and were explored in the Crossroads of Continents exhibit. But we couldn't come to final conclusions. We raised issues and looked at things, found lots of comparisons, lots of things that were very similar between the cultures of the Ainu and the early cultures of northwestern Pacific, Siberia, and so forth, and the Alaskan peoples. But we still have a lot of research to do in the Trans-Beringian deeper culture, sources of the Eskimo culture in those areas. And I made a couple of attempts to try to see if I could figure out something about this, and I worked with the Russians crossing northern Siberia. We looked at sites all across the Russian north, flying in Antonov 2 airplanes and icebreakers and so forth, and discovered, great materials from the early Ainu, the early folks of the Nenets of the western Siberia, Yamal, and so forth. But we couldn't find anything really that made sense in terms of connections to the east. In other words, the early cultures that we found, even going back into the 8,000-year-old Yana sites and Zhukov sites and so forth, there was a lot of wonderful material there, but it was looking like nothing to do with early Eskimo art or technology. So we kind of crossed off the North Siberia as a source of Eskimo origins, and began looking at the areas to the south, Mongolia, Eastern Asia, Jomon culture in Japan, Kamchatka, and other places. And the X's here means that we don't have any good connections in the Eskimo culture origins there. Much more interesting are the Scythian connections and the connections along the coast of the Pacific. So these very beautifully illustrated, these Ainu robes. We found basketry that is exactly identical between the Ainu and the Southwest Yupik people. A lot of connections there. And we began to look into Mongolia as another source of connections. And so I've spent 10 or 15 years working on Mongolia deer stones and the Scythian cultures, which we discovered had originated in the Mongolia area 500 years earlier in the deer stone late Bronze Age horizons there. And that is where currently we think that most of the, many of the influences that reached the North Pacific and the early Eskimo cultures are coming out of Mongolia and East Asia. Just beautiful, these monuments were gorgeous. And you can see some of the art of this transformational figure here. This is a deer with big scrolling antlers, but with the head of a bird and a big, huge bill here. Clearly not just an Asian stag, but it's some kind of a transformational animal. So these kind of concepts were very deeply enrooted into the early Eskimo art as well. But the connections, physical connections to how does these kind of things and the Scythian culture, how did they reach the Bering Sea? That's another unanswered question. And I'll just end here with a couple of comments on the modern situation. As we see today, the Arctic ice is melting, and people are exploring the undersea, the undersea deposits for oil and hydrocarbons and minerals and so on, and the impacts of areas which until the 20th century, really until the 21st century, were very traditional, very low population, no urban centers and so forth. Now all these areas are being infested with industrial opportunities, not only in the shipping across the Arctic Ocean, but the exploitation of materials on the lands and seabeds around them, with huge implications for, for the animals that northern peoples have survived with for many thousands of years. And we have, facing us now the biggest change in any world system that we've ever seen, and it's the disappearance of the Arctic ice. And you can imagine, how big an impact that's going to have from an area that had 100 years ago been a kind of a refuge for cultures that had very little contact with the outside world, all of a sudden, coming in contact with the most modern developments that industry can provide, or militarization and these kind of issues as well. So one thought it has struck me was the difference between the 1 degree of temperature between, say, 32 and 33 Fahrenheit, the change that comes when you have a 1 degree shift in the temperature where you lose your standard ice platform, the things you can walk on, drive on, travel, et cetera, that made the circumpolar region so accessible to many people, now becomes impossible for traditional means to really access animals and so forth. So it's a huge change that is coming, and we have a lot of in addition to those, there's tourism, population growth, language loss, cultural erosion, introduced diseases, social distress, climate change, and so forth. So the North is becoming a place that is much more vulnerable to a lot of the changes that we're seeing happening very, very rapidly around us. So a couple of final thoughts here. The Arctic is warming faster than other regions. Change is inevitable, but we can influence its outcome and adapt. The Arctic offers lessons, extinction, migration, new technologies from the past for the future. And finally, we need to look at the future with some humility and respect, and a sense of humor may be useful. And this is, to me, embodied in this wonderful picture of a North Alaskan Inupiat guy in the middle of his, snowfield on the Arctic ice, rather nonchalantly looking toward the future. And I think from what we know of the Inuit history in the North and the abilities of traditional cultures and people, that there will be many solutions that those people will be able to generate to meet these challenges in the future. So yeah, I want to thank Sealaska very much for the invitation to come and speak to you a little bit, and hopefully to the schools and some others who hear this talk. The Arctic is, in one person's lifetime, has come from a place that was inaccessible, where the native peoples were very traditional, knew very little about the outside world, to one in which they're front and center in the middle of a lot of our thoughts today. So it's an amazing time we're living in, and it's one that we should relish and do the best we can to assist researchers, the indigenous peoples, and looking forward to a new kind of life in the Arctic region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now open up some question and answer. We had one question from a viewer who could not sign into the chat. When did the Inuit arrive in Alaska? Did they come over the land bridge, or did they come by boat?
Well, Bering Strait has never been a barrier to indigenous people. And we know the first Paleo-Inuit arrived in Alaska around 4,500 years ago from northern Siberia. They were largely reindeer hunters at that time. They hadn't developed a big sea mammal hunting culture, but that began to develop as soon as they were in the New World. And of course, we have a lot of those very early Eskimo sites, Denby culture and others, and they migrated, as I mentioned, into Canada around 4,000 years ago. And then there was the second migration, which was what we call the Thule migration around 1300. These were the people who were the whale hunters. They had learned how to hunt really large bowhead whales in the northern Bering Sea, probably by a long period of experimentation. And then they spread into Canada, into Greenland, and became the second wave. So, you know, we've had these kind of major waves that occurred from Siberia and the northern Bering Sea region into Alaska and into Canada. And then there was a much more earlier migration of Paleo-Eskimo people. And we know some of this from the genetics of these populations today. Sir?
Whether or not you pointed to some of the relationships or potential relationships between Siberian Inuit and Inuit-Basque, and contrasted some of the art forms, and I was wondering whether or not there was any linguistic analysis to show patterns or similarities between Inuit-Basque, Inuit, and Mongolian and or
well, the northwest coast, the Na-Dene peoples, you know, their languages have been compared to some early Ket languages in central western Siberia. And this is work that's been done by VIDA and others at UAF. There's still a lot more work to be done, but that correlates quite closely with one of the major migrations into the New World, which is probably preceding the later Inuit expansions and so forth. There are a lot of similarities in Inuit culture in northeastern Siberia, but it looks like the origins are going to be in place in the northern Bering Sea for a lot of these cultures, with influences coming up from places like Japan, Hokkaido, Kamchatka, the Amur River, and so on. There are early harpoon heads that were found 6,000 to 7,000 years ago in East Asia that look like they could be the source for toggling harpoons. But languages are pretty difficult to trace back, when you get more than a couple thousand years old. So there's the Native Alaska Language Center in Fairbanks has got people who do a lot of this kind of work. I'm afraid I don't really have my finger on the pulse of that latest work. But there has been a division between the southern, like the Aleut, Eskimo languages, and the Inupiat languages and so forth for a long time. So we think that those languages have been separated for probably 6,000 years or more.
Thank you, Bill, for this great exposition. Looking forward to your book on this. Maybe autobiographical, but I was wondering if you can, down here we put a lot of weight into the discovery at Hashuka, at the cave on Prince of Wales Island that documented a young man 10,300 years ago. And so I was wondering if you can connect your story of the migration across, the Bering Straits with that individual who apparently came down through a coastal migration route.
I don't know. It's been so long since I was reading more Alaskan literature, so I really can't comment on that particular case. But my connection to it, runs through Henry Collins and mentorship that I had with him. And when I arrived at the Smithsonian, I realized that right above my head were all of these amazing collections from St. Lawrence Island that Henry had excavated. And I wondered what I would do about them. And the opportunity came when the director of the museum said, why don't you see what you can do with some of this Nelson material and put it on an exhibit. And with Susan Kaplan, we put on the Inuit exhibit and so forth. And it gave me a chance to go up into the attic, and I began to wear colors that I was seeing in the collections. I was looking for shirts and socks that were kind of maroon from the ochre I was seeing and I began to see the spirit images in these artifacts, which had been built into bowls and harpoons and everything. It was really an amazing experience. I have very little ability to, you know, I can't do what the linguists like Lear and others and everybody have done with these things, and I don't know enough about the particular history of that individual. But you know, the connections between those, the Bering Sea people and the Northwest Coast people, that's still another major area. It was so different from what I was experiencing in the Labrador system, when you had such an opposition between, you know, the Inuit peoples and the Boreal peoples, the Innu people, almost no contact over thousands of years, and more, you know, just like an accordion back and forth. Whereas here, there's so much more interaction, cultural exchange across those borders and so forth. There's a lot of work, I mean, it's going to be wonderful work that's going to come out of the linguistics of that area eventually. Thank God that a lot of the languages are being retaught again, trying to be preserved anyway, you know. Well.
So
Yeah.
you've had an amazing career, and I think most archaeologists would be, you know, envious of what you've gotten done. But what did you do this summer? When's your next dig? You know, I'm sure you haven't given up going out in the field or things like that.
I've had a lot of trouble quitting field work. I got into anthropology because of field work, and you know, I began to realize that canoeing in Canada and Newfoundland, working with Elmer Harp and places, you know, I just realized there was a tremendous amount we could learn from things that were in the ground and so forth, as well as from the people we were meeting. And it's tough giving it up. I'm probably going to retire, or at least partially retire, in January this year. And I'm in the midst of publishing Mongolia stuff. I've got one book on Mongolia Bronze Age, which is now out, and another one on comparing rock art and archaeology in the Altai Mountains of Mongolia. And you know, then I'm going to work my way back to Labrador and the work we did in the Northern Torngats with Dick Jordan and Aaron Kroll and others, Stephen Loring. So yeah, that's why I couldn't resist sort of dipping into my history a little bit for this talk, partly because you know, so many things have happened in this part of the world, in Alaska, in the last 20 years, when I really haven't been keeping up with what's been happening. But you know, at least in my superficial understanding, we're still pretty much with question marks with most of these things, whereas we've resolved a lot of the questions in the Eastern Arctic and the Northeast, simply because of the simpler environmental system that's operating there. And here you have so many complexities going back deep into time that it's much more difficult. And as we know, anthropology and archaeology in particular is changing vastly now, so that there's, you know, the idea of a researcher running off to dig a site or something, forget it, you know, that's not there, you know. The researcher is going to have to invest years, going to have to get into the linguistics, into the social life of the people he wants to work with and so forth, which is really great. I mean, it's the young folks who are getting into these fields today are getting into the right way through partnerships. And of course, the museums are having a struggle because of repatriation. What can they put on exhibit? How do they do it? Who do they contact, you know, for information, for permission, and so forth. So it's you know, we're facing an entirely different social system for intellectual work and anthropology these days. And the bright lights are always the indigenous people who are starting to become interested in the questions of their history and relationships as well. What we don't need any more of is this kind of stuff that's happening now with Russia, which is such a tragedy, because we had developed terrific relationships with a lot of Russian ethnographers, linguists, archaeologists, and others, and they won't, you know, we can't even talk to them today, you know. So that has to be resolved so that we can make progress on some of these big questions, you know, where do things come from and influences and so forth. It's exciting. I'll watch down from the top, see what it looks like 20, 30 years from now. Hopefully it'll be, you know, things will be moving forward. And what Sealaska has done is terrific too. I mean, just to inspire people, educate youngsters, and so forth in a way that, you know, it's this is what's needed for cultures to really thrive and survive today. And you've been such a good example here of that. I hope that happens in many other places in the world. I'll hang around afterwards.
Thank you.
If you want to have other questions.
Ashish, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much.